Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a great 2022 so far. Now, I love American history. I've reacted to a number of videos on it on this channel. So we've looked at the Revolution, the Civil War, Theodore Roosevelt. We looked at the Prohibition era, the Cold War. What I've really been lacking is kind of one overarching structure. One video that sums up the whole lot in one go. So that's what we're doing today. It is a history of the United States of America in 10 minutes, which is perfect because 9 minutes wouldn't be enough, would it? 9 minutes would be leaving things out, whereas 11 minutes would just be overkill. So yeah, 10 minutes is perfect. So yeah, of course, the original video will be in the description. I hope you enjoy, and please do subscribe if you haven't already. America!
Even if the United States of America emerged as an independent country after 1776 and recognized in 1783, the history of these lands is deeper than that. Thousands of years ago, the first people settled in the American continent. It is not exactly known how the Native Americans first settled in these territories. But a theory says that people migrated from Eurasia starting 30,000 years ago, across a land bridge.
So if that's one of the theories, what are the other theories? What are kind of the rival theories? I'd be really interested to know. I will, as soon as this video is over, I'm going to go and Google that.
Known as Beringia. This connected Siberia to North America during the Ice Age. This migration continued until 10,000 years ago. At that time, the glacial period ended, and the land bridge became submerged by the rising ocean.
So that cuts off the route to Asia.
The early inhabitants were called the Paleo-Americans. In time, they migrated even deeper in Americas.
So does that mean that according to this theory, the kind of the Native Americans that first arrived from Asia are essentially the same people that went to populate Central America and South America? So kind of the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans, all come from kind of the same origin as the tribes of North America. I assume so, but I'm not completely sure.
And they formed tribes and nations. They created interesting civilizations, developing their own culture. Among the cultures that existed here, we can mention Adena culture, Iroquois culture, Coles Creek culture, Puebloan culture.
I know the Iroquois were very involved in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War was called in Europe, and also in the Revolutionary War. So I know that they were one of the ones that kind of interacted first with the American settlers.
And Mississippian culture.
But I think one really interesting question is like, what would have happened in North America had the Europeans never arrived, and had no kind of rival imperial power arrived as well? So not say China or the Ottoman Empire arrives instead. Would the advanced civilizations of South and Central America push north? The Aztecs, Incas, Mayans. Would we have seen whole new empires spouting out of Native American tribes? I think it's a really interesting question, and obviously something we'll never know the answer to, but it would be a great subject for some alternative history.
But another part of today, the United States has an interesting and different history. Speaking about Hawaii, this land wasn't inhabited until the first centuries AD. Native development started with the settlement of Polynesian people between the 1st and 10th centuries.
To that is late. So there are some parts of the world which were populated by humans remarkably late. So the one that really jumps to mind is New Zealand, which I don't think was populated by the Maori or their descendants until the 14th or 15th century. So even quite late, until very recently, in terms of, by comparison to how long humans have been around for, there were some parts of the world we hadn't got to. Now we have, of course.
European colonization began. In 1492, a Spanish expedition headed by the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus sailed west to find a new trade route.
So, but there's always been this question about why Europeans suddenly became so interested in trying to find an alternative route to China. And there's various theories. One of the ones I find quite interesting is that it may have coincided with the final collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, which made it much harder for Europeans to trade with the sort of traditional route that they used to use, which would go through the Ottoman Empire towards India along the Silk Road to China. That route became a lot less viable, and so the incentives for Europeans to look for new routes to China, which was kind of where the riches were, became much higher. I mean, of course, changes in naval technology almost certainly played a role as well. Even if the Vikings did very briefly probably beat the Spanish.
To the far east, but landed in what came to be known to Europeans as the New World. After this event, in the next decades, more and more ships sailed west to establish colonies and trade posts. The Spaniards began building their American empire, using islands such as Cuba, Puerto.
I think it's hard to overstate just how crazy it would have been for the original inhabitants of North, South, Central America when the first Europeans arrived. Obviously, we get this loads of the Aztecs, where initially they're not sure if the Spanish are gods or demons or what they are. But just people coming along. I mean, if you can imagine. People coming along who you've never seen people with their skin tone before. They've got explosives, they've got steel weapons, steel armor. They're riding on horses. I can totally understand how people might have thought, these people are gods, or this is the apocalypse, or just been completely blown away by it.
Rico and Hispaniola as bases. They expanded hugely. France founded colonies in Eastern North America, a number of Caribbean islands, and small coastal parts of South America.
So a key point is that during the early early stages of the colonization of North America, it was the Caribbean sugar islands that were really, really valuable, not North America itself. I mean, that would change as populations increased in North America. But certainly for the European imperial powers, the bit they were really keen to control was islands in the Caribbean, because they made huge amounts of money. And Massachusetts and Canada were. They came along later. Obviously, they eventually surpassed the Caribbean, but they came along later.
Portugal colonized Brazil. The eastern seacoast was settled primarily by English colonists in the 17th century.
So basically, the Pope divided South America, and he kind of said, like, everything on this side of this line is Portuguese, and everything on this side of the line is Spanish, which is one hell of a power move. I don't think it was so relevant for North America, but that's kind of what happened in South America.
Along with a much smaller number of Dutch and Swedes. The first successful English colony, Jamestown, was established in 1607 on the James River in Virginia. New wave of settlers arrived in the late 17th century and established commercial agriculture based on tobacco. Even though there were some conflicts between the Native Americans and English settlers, the colonies managed to expand pretty fast, and more people settled in. Each of the 13 American colonies had slightly different governmental structure. In fact, a colony was ruled by a governor appointed from London. This governor controlled the administration and relied upon a locally elected legislature to vote taxes and make laws. By the 18th century, the American colonies were growing very rapidly, and as a result of low death rates, along with ample supplies of land and food, this attracted a heavy flow of immigrants.
So I don't know if these immigrants were just coming from the British Isles, which obviously they must have been, or kind of from wider other parts of Europe as well. I mean, you kind of assume that the French and the Dutch, well, I think the Dutch lost their colonies by this point in North America, but the French were settled in their own areas, the British and Irish in the British Empire. But I'd be interested to know if people not from the British Isles were already at this point arriving in the 13 colonies.
Tobacco and rice plantations imported African slaves for labor from the British colonies.
Yeah, so that's obviously horrendous. It's America's original sin, albeit one that they carried over from the Europeans. I think the British, the Portuguese, I think were the worst for slave trading. Although the Spanish, the French, the Dutch were also involved. But yeah, no, it was a truly horrendous practice. That I think we can still see the outcome or the impacts of it on America today in terms of kind of social tensions.
In the West Indies, and by the 1770s, African slaves comprised a fifth of the American population.
Yeah, it's horrible.
The question of independence from Britain did not arise as long as the colonies needed British military support against the French and Spanish.
You need us, America!
The French and Indian War was an event created by the political development of the colonies. It was also part of the larger 7 Years' War. Britain beat French forces.
So there's a strong case. I mean, some people call the 7 Years' War the First World War, which is kind of possibly stretching it a bit, but there is some truth to that. I mean, it was primarily fought in Europe, but there's also the North American theatre, the French and Indian War. It was fought in India. It was fought a bit in Africa. It's probably the first conflict which was fought on sort of four continents. Certainly, I can't think of any others. If you can, comment below because I'll be really interested. But yeah, no, it was a huge, it was a disaster for the French.
And France lost their colonies and territories in Canada and
I
Louisiana.
mean, look
The
at all
war
that
was
territory.
costly,
It's
and Britain needed
crazy.
money. The British Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, imposing a tax on the colonies without going through the colonial legislatures. The issue was drawn. Did Parliament have this right to tax Americans who were not represented in it, crying, "No taxation without representation"?
Again, I love alternative history, so I know I keep coming up with this stuff. But what would have happened if the British government had agreed to give the American colonies representation in the Westminster Parliament, i.e., if Massachusetts and North Carolina and South Carolina and so on had sent delegates to the Parliament in London in the same way as parts of Britain itself. I mean, I kind of assume that would eventually fallen apart and wouldn't have worked long term. But could that have postponed the revolution? Could that have tied the colonies more closely to Britain itself? I don't know. I think an interesting question.
The colonists refused to pay the taxes as tensions escalated in the
I
late
sympathise with them
1760s
on that
and
point.
early 1770s. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 was marked as the start of the revolution. It happened in the town of Boston to protest against the new tax.
How it got its name.
Parliament quickly responded the next year with the Coercive Acts, stripping Massachusetts of its historic right of self-government.
So it does seem that the British government kind of was quite provocative, and again, because you kind of wonder if they'd been if they'd made more concessions, whether the revolution could have been avoided, and then what would have happened? Would America eventually become independent but maintain stronger links with Britain, like Canada did for example? I mean, there was an attempted revolution in Canada, which was partly led to concessions from London. Yeah, I don't know, but it's fascinating.
Putting it under army rule, which sparked outrage and resistance in all 13 colonies. Leaders from all 13 colonies gathered and created the First Continental Congress to coordinate their resistance.
USA.
Congress called for a boycott of British trade, published a list of rights and grievances, and petitioned the king for redress of those grievances. It wasn't about independence at that point, but this appeal had no effect, and so the Second Continental Congress was created in 1775 in order to organize the defense of the colonies against the British Army. The 13 colonies began a rebellion against British rule in 17...
So what's kind of fascinating is that the American revolutionaries, the original Americans, were very heavily influenced by a certain type of English liberalism. But it's almost, I mean, some people make the argument. I mean, it's definitely an overstated argument. I don't agree with it, but I think it's kind of interesting that the American Revolutionary War, War of Independence, was almost a continuation of the English Civil War, in that it was a confrontation over the rights of Parliament versus the rights of absolute monarchy or a foreign parliament to tax without permission. So you can definitely see how there's a continuity, even if it's obviously a little bit more complicated than that. And American national identity is starting to become a thing at this time as well.
1775, and proclaimed their independence in 1776 as the United States of America.
Yeah.
In the American
It was a huge
Revolutionary
day.
War, 1775 to 1783, the Americans captured the British invasion army at Saratoga in 1777, secured the Northeast.
So it was the American victory in Saratoga that was key in persuading the French to get involved. Because up until that point, the French, I mean, if the French wanted any excuse to have a go at the British, especially after the 7 Years' War, but they were a little bit nervous to start with. It was Saratoga that told the French that the Americans are a serious military force. These people are an ally we can work with.
And encouraged the French to make a military alliance with the United States.
Yes.
France brought in Spain and the
Yeah,
Netherlands, thus balancing the military and naval forces on each side, as Britain had no allies. General George Washington was an excellent organizer and administrator, who worked successfully with Congress and the state governors, selecting and mentoring his senior officers, supporting and training his troops, and maintaining an idealistic Republican army. The American Revolution was a success, and at the Peace of Paris of 1783, their independence was recognized. And even so, the former colonies gained more than expected. the expansion to the
Oh,
west.
okay, so here's an interesting question. What would have happened if Britain had tried to hold on to not the 13 colonies, if Britain had recognised the 13 colonies as an independent state, but tried to hold on to kind of the Midwestern area, which apparently was also given to the United States? I presume that would have led to another conflict at some point between the two, which the Americans probably would have won. So maybe the War of 1812 would have happened even earlier. I don't know. I love these kind of alternative scenarios.
Started, incorporating the Amerindian lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. A deal was made by the United States President Thomas Jefferson in 1803. He bought the Louisiana Territory from France. Initial diplomats sent to France world.
And look at how big it is. That's insane. I mean, that's the bargain of the millennium. I mean, the United States is almost doubled in size by the look of things. That's a huge amount of territory.
Allowed to spend up to 10 million US dollars in order to buy just New Orleans and, if possible, the west bank of the Mississippi River. But the French government said that for $5 million more, all of the Louisiana Territory would be sold. The president approved the deal and the U.S. doubled its size.
That is the deal of the century. No wonder Americans are so entrepreneurial, and that's fantastic. I mean, because obviously America would go on to buy Alaska from Russia. So yeah, I mean, the extent to which the United States managed to expand through purchase rather than conquest is really very impressive. I mean, obviously the reason that the French were so keen to sell was this was during the Napoleonic War, when they were absolutely desperate for money to fight, well, pretty much the rest of Europe. But even so, it's a really big sacrifice for them to make.
In the middle of the 19th century, some cessions were happening, and Texas in joining the Union in 1845, and after the war against Mexico.
So when did Florida join the United States? Because last time I saw it was under in the last video it was yellow, so that was Spanish. But I then thought it was captured by the British in the 7 Years' War. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to Google this. I'm not entirely sure what happened with Canada. We're sorry, with Florida.
An empire, the United States will take important lands and expand even further. In 1861, after Abraham Lincoln was elected, some states from the South, the Confederation, attacked the rest. The South Revolt was happening due to controversy over the enslavement of black people. In 1860, the United States was led by Abraham Lincoln, supporting banning slavery in all territories. War broke out in April.
Although wasn't my understanding, I might be wrong about this, but my understanding is that whilst Lincoln was always against slavery, he only really introduced the prohibition in response to the secession of the southern states. That is to say that had the southern states not ceded from the Union, he probably would have tolerated slavery, even though he didn't really like it. That's my understanding. I might be wrong. I mean, please do comment below. Let me know if I'm wrong. But yeah, I think there's some quote where he basically said that if maintaining slavery would maintain the integrity of the United States, that he would be prepared to accept that as a necessary evil. But I say I may be missing some details here.
April 1861, when secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Yeah. After 4 years of war, the Union achieved its victory, and the Confederates were defeated. National unity was slowly restored. The national government expanded its power.
I've just realised why they had the target on Lincoln. Obviously references assassination.
The 19th century was a period of economic expansion. More and more industries were created, and also the accent was put on infrastructure. In 1898, the American-Spanish War is happening. Americans are winning in short term some battles, and at the Treaty of Paris, U.S. is getting the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam.
So I think I've talked about this before, but this is such a fascinating moment in American history, because it's the moment where very briefly America starts to go on a different course, almost on a more European course. So around this time, all the main European powers were building up overseas empires: France, Britain, Spain, Germany, etc. And the United States was largely a continental empire. I mean, probably the comparison would be Russia, a continental empire of European origin. But the United States started building an overseas empire, and this didn't last very long. Obviously, they took Cuba, they took the Philippines. I think there was quite a bad armed insurgency against their rule in the Philippines. But you can kind of see how America could have gone in a different direction and started claiming colonies all over the place, as other European countries were doing. So Theodore Roosevelt, who was the was one of the presidents around this time, was very imperialistic. And it's very interesting how America definitely stuck to its values a lot better than it could have done. Then it could have sort of abandoned the liberal principles and gone full European, but it didn't, which I think is to its credit.
At the beginning of the 20th century, World War I started. Even though the US was neutral due to German attacks on the American ships and due to their intentions to make Mexico join against the US, the Americans joined the Allies. After this event, the economy was growing and all was good until the Great Depression, which
I
started
knew it
in
wouldn't last long.
1929. This event shook the world and created a base on which the Second World War will start. The United States joined the Allies after being attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, by the Japanese Empire. Americans fought.
And that was just a bonkers thing to do for the Japanese. If you compare their GDP per capita or their population size, excluding colonies, because the Empire of Japan obviously included lots of colonies, it was a really, really ballsy move of Japan to think it had a chance against the United States. And of course, as it turns out, they didn't really.
Fought a distant war in Europe, Pacific, and they provided supplies to the Soviets.
Yeah.
Armored cars, motorized equipment, food, etc. Winning battle by battle in the Pacific, getting closer to the Japanese mainland, and after D-Day in Europe in 1944, the Americans managed to have a great impact and to help a lot on the Allied side.
And whilst the bulk of the work of defeating Nazi Germany was done by the Soviet Union, in terms of the number of German troops killed, the vast majority were killed on the Eastern Front. But the American intervention was key in essentially allowing Western Europe to be liberated by Western powers rather than the Soviets. So, because Britain alone couldn't have done it. Maybe Britain could have liberated bits of it, maybe France, but certainly not the whole of Western Europe, which is what happened. And that meant that the whole of Western Europe did not become communist, and parts of Central Europe as well. So, yeah, the American intervention in Europe was crucial in setting up the entire structure of what Europe is today.
War ended in 1945. Germany capitulated in May.
Right.
And in September, after the 2 nuclear bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers in the aftermath of World War II.
So, it's almost as though the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of the last powers left. Or the last sort of powers left in a good state after the Second World War. So all their rivals, obviously Germany and Japan, were collapsed. Their empires were destroyed. Same with Britain and France, though. Even though Britain was technically a victor, it cost it so much in terms of money and treasure. But it essentially marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire. So it was almost so kind of the USA and the USSR were the 2 powers left at the end of the Second World War.
This was a period known as the Cold War. The 2 countries confronted each other indirectly in the arms race, proxy wars across the world, including the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and propaganda campaigns. The purpose of this was to stop the spread of communism. In the 1960s, waves of civil rights movements started. Rights of voting and freedom of movement to African Americans and other racial minorities. The Cold War.
So I would love to know more about that, because honestly that's not a period I know enough about. Kind of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. There must be some videos on here. I will try and find them and possibly do reactions.
Ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. After, the United States has been focusing on modern conflicts in the Middle East. The beginning of the 21st century saw the September 11th attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda in 2001, which was later followed by the wars in Iraq.
That, honestly, 9/11 is one of the first events in world history I can remember. Obviously it was a horrendous attack, a complete tragedy. But I was playing football, so I was doing football or soccer for Americans. I was doing soccer practice. And I got picked up by my mum, and she said some planes had flown into some buildings in New York. And I remember thinking, well, is that a big deal? I kind of assumed she meant sort of little 1 or 2 seater planes. Then I got home and I saw the news, and it was obviously just horrendous. And I'm sure for Americans it was even worse. The horror of what happened.
Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2008, the United States had its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. A big thank you again to our sponsor. Don't forget.
Yeah, so that was a very good summary. It went really, really quickly. I think because there was quite a bit of time on kind of the period before the United States was even created, but it kind of seemed that once the United States was created, we just zoomed through. So there's loads of stuff I was expecting, like the Mexican-American War, the Texas ceding from Mexico, etc. But just didn't feature at all, and especially American domestic politics. But that has been really useful in helping me put my scraps of knowledge of American history together. So I say thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found that interesting or enjoyable, or preferably both. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, and I hope to see you again.